Imagine this: a small, peaceful town where everyone knows each other's name, where the Clutter family's farm stands as a symbol of success, respect, and integrity. But one morning, the serenity is broken. The Clutter home falls silent, no breakfast smells wafting through the kitchen, no cheerful chatter from Nancy or Kenyon. By evening, the shocking truth would unravel: a crime so chilling, so senseless, it left the entire nation asking one question: why? Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon, were not just any family in Holcomb, Kansas. They were the heart of it. Herbert, a self made man, managed a thriving wheat farm. Bonnie, though battling personal struggles, radiated kindness. Nancy, the perfect student, and Kenyon, a bright young man with a passion for machines, were beloved by their peers. But on November 15th, 1959, everything changed. The Clutter's story would no longer be one of inspiration. It would become one of tragedy, mystery, and unanswered questions that linger to this day. The morning sun crept over the Kansas plains, casting light on a house that had suddenly fallen dark. The Clutter's home, usually alive with early morning activity, sat unnervingly still. No one answered the phone. No one emerged from the house. It wasn't like the Clutters to break routine, and in Holcomb, people noticed these things. By late morning, Nancy's best friend grew anxious. She had plans to meet Nancy for church, but her calls went unanswered. Concerned, she convinced her father to drive her to the Clutter house. When they arrived, the front door was unlocked, a detail that immediately set their nerves on edge. As they stepped inside, a bone-chilling silence greeted them. What they found next would scar them forever. Room by room, the horrifying truth unfolded. Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their children Nancy and Kenyon had all been brutally murdered. Each family member had been bound, their lives extinguished with calculated brutality. The final moments of the Clutters' lives painted a terrifying picture, one of cold precision and unimaginable violence. The neighbors fled the scene, calling for help, but the damage was done. By the time authorities arrived, the murders had already begun to ripple through the town, spreading fear like wildfire. In Holcomb, nothing like this had ever happened before. The question that burned in everyone's mind was the one no one could answer. Who would do this and why? The scene inside the Clutter home was one that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. The KBI agents, led by Alvin Dewey, arrived at the farmhouse that Sunday afternoon and stepped into a tableau of methodical violence. Herbert Clutter was discovered in the basement, bound at the wrists and ankles, his throat slashed, and a shotgun blast ending his life. Nearby, Kenyon lay slumped on a couch, tied up and shot in the head. Upstairs, Bonnie and Nancy were found in their bedrooms, each bound and killed with a single merciless shot. It was a calculated and systematic execution of an entire family. What struck investigators the most was the eerie precision of the crime. There were no signs of a struggle. The bindings were neat, the victims positioned as though the killers had complete control from start to finish. It was as if the family had been overpowered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The motive, however, was nowhere to be found. Drawers weren't ransacked, valuables were left untouched, and the house showed no sign of forced entry. There was no safe, no hidden stash of cash. The entire premise of robbery seemed to fall apart under scrutiny. As the agents meticulously examined the scene, one chilling realization began to settle in. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. But if not robbery, then why had the Clutters been targeted? And who could commit such a heartless crime in a town where everyone knew each other? The answers were nowhere to be found at the scene, but the questions it raised cast a dark shadow over the town of Holcomb and the investigation to come. The murders of the Clutter family sent shockwaves through Holcomb and far beyond. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation (KBI) quickly took charge of the case, with Agent Alvin Dewey at the helm. Dewey, a seasoned investigator with deep ties to the community, was determined to bring the killers to justice. Yet, as he stepped into the role, one thing became painfully clear: there were almost no leads. The crime scene offered little in terms of clues. No fingerprints, no clear motive. Just a chilling display of violence that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Dewey and his team began combing through the town, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Neighbors recounted the night before, but nothing stood out. There were no strange cars, no sounds of distress. In a community as close-knit as Holcomb, the lack of chatter was unsettling. The Clutters were universally loved. No one could fathom a motive for such cruelty. As days turned into weeks, fear tightened its grip on the town. Families locked their doors at night, something they had never done before. Husbands and wives took turns staying awake, watching over their children. The thought that someone capable of such brutality might still be lurking nearby kept everyone on edge. The KBI agents expanded their search, piecing together the Clutter's final hours. Herbert Clutter had cashed a check for a modest sum the day before the murders, but the money wasn't missing. There were no signs of enemies, disputes, or anyone harboring ill will toward the family. The deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the mystery became. Was this the work of a stranger, or someone closer than anyone dared to believe? As theories swirled and the pressure to solve the case mounted, the agents knew they needed a break, a single thread to unravel the chilling puzzle. For weeks, the investigation felt like chasing shadows. Every lead turned cold, every theory hit a wall. The Clutter's murder seemed destined to remain an enigma. That was until a voice from the past broke the silence. An inmate at the Kansas State Penitentiary, recently released, approached authorities with a tip that would change everything. He spoke of a man named Richard Dick Hickock, someone he had shared a cell with. According to the informant, Hickock had spoken at length about a foolproof plan to rob a wealthy farmer in Holcomb. The details were chillingly specific. Hickock believed the farmer Herbert Clutter kept a safe in his home, one brimming with cash. He described the family in detail, right down to the layout of their house. Hickock had even bragged about bringing along an accomplice, someone he claimed was as ruthless as they come. That man's name was Perry Smith. This tip lit a fire under the KBI. Hickock and Smith weren't just names, they were potential suspects with clear intent, but their whereabouts remained unknown. The informant's testimony gave investigators their first glimmer of hope, but also a sobering realization. If the killers had planned the robbery, what went so horribly wrong that it ended in mass murder? Dewey and his team began piecing together the movements of Hickock and Smith, delving into their criminal histories and tracing their steps. Every thread seemed to lead back to that fateful night in Holcomb. For the first time, the investigation had a direction, a path that might finally answer the haunting question: who killed the Clutter family and why? But as they pursued the leads, one thing loomed over the case. If these men were capable of such cold-blooded brutality, what were they doing now, and how far would they go to stay free? With the informant's testimony in hand, the KBI began to focus on two names, Richard Hickock and Perry Smith. Both men had criminal records, both had been recently paroled, and both fit the profile of individuals capable of a crime driven by desperation. But as investigators delved into their backgrounds, an unsettling portrait began to emerge. Richard Hickock, a smooth talking charmer, had a history of petty theft and forgery. Behind his seemingly confident demeanor lay a man burdened by debt and a crumbling personal life. Hickock was desperate for a way out of his downward spiral, and the Clutters, with their rumored wealth, had presented him with what he thought was the perfect opportunity. Perry Smith, on the other hand, was a drifter with a deeply troubled past. Abused as a child and scarred by his time in reform schools and prisons, Perry carried a simmering anger beneath his quiet exterior. He was intelligent but volatile, a man teetering on the edge, with little to lose and a knack for following others down dark paths. Together, Hickock and Smith made a dangerous pair. Hickock was the planner, the one who spun tales of easy money and foolproof heists. Perry was the enforcer, the one who Hickock believed could handle the dirty work if things went south. As the KBI tracked their movements, a pattern emerged. The two had left Kansas shortly after the murders, zigzagging across state lines, using bad checks to fund their journey. It was as if they were trying to outrun something or someone. Their trail was erratic, but not invisible, and the agents began piecing together their path. For the first time, the case had faces and motives. These were not faceless monsters. They were two men, flawed and broken, whose desperation had led them to the Clutter home that night. But what investigators didn't yet know was the full extent of their involvement, and whether they had any intention of being caught. The net was tightening, but with every day that passed, one chilling thought lingered. Were Hickock and Smith planning their next crime, or had the Clutters been their final, catastrophic act? With Richard Hickock and Perry Smith identified as prime suspects, the KBI faced the daunting task of tracking down two men who seemed to be constantly on the move. Armed with descriptions and details about their vehicle, a black 1949 Chevrolet sedan, law enforcement agencies across the country were alerted. A nationwide manhunt was underway. Hickock and Smith had left Kansas shortly after the murders, embarking on a cross-country journey that seemed designed to elude capture. They drifted through small towns and big cities, cashing forged checks to fund their travels. Their movements were unpredictable, one day in Texas, the next in California, making it difficult for authorities to stay close on their trail. Every few days, new sightings trickled in. A gas station attendant in Oklahoma recalled two men fitting their descriptions who had acted suspiciously while paying for fuel. A waitress in Nevada remembered a pair who seemed unusually nervous and left in a hurry. But by the time these tips reached investigators, the fugitives were already gone, leaving behind only vague clues. For the KBI, it was a game of cat and mouse. Dewey and his team meticulously pieced together their movements, analyzing each report for patterns. The suspects' erratic behavior suggested they were not just running, they were spiraling. The pressure of being hunted, combined with their dwindling funds, appeared to be taking a toll. As the chase intensified, Hickock and Smith began making mistakes. Forged checks started bouncing, and their encounters with locals grew more reckless. The KBI could feel the walls closing in, but the question remained: would they catch these men before they vanished for good, or before they struck again? The manhunt reached a critical turning point when investigators uncovered a new lead that would finally bring them face to face with the killers. But until then, the nation waited in fear, knowing two dangerous men were still out there, somewhere free. The relentless manhunt for Richard Hickock and Perry Smith reached its crescendo on December 30th, 1959. The fugitives, who had been slipping through the cracks for weeks, finally made a critical mistake that led authorities straight to them. In Las Vegas, Hickock and Smith had been staying under the radar, but their money was running low and desperation made them reckless. Hickock attempted to pass another forged check at a local store, unaware that the clerk had grown suspicious. The clerk contacted the police, providing descriptions of the two men and their car. Local law enforcement, now on high alert thanks to the nationwide bulletins from the KBI, quickly recognized the pair as the wanted fugitives from Kansas. Officers set up surveillance near the suspect's car, waiting for the right moment to make their move. That moment came when Hickock and Smith returned to their vehicle later that day, seemingly unaware that their time on the run was about to end. As they climbed into the car, police swarmed, guns drawn, giving the suspects no chance to flee. Hickock and Smith were arrested without a fight. Their capture sent shockwaves through Holcomb. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, the community finally had a glimmer of hope. The men who had brought terror to their small town were now in custody, and justice seemed within reach. For the investigators, the arrest was a triumph, but it was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, unraveling the truth of what had happened that night in the Clutter home and proving that these two men were responsible. But even as Hickock and Smith sat in custody, one question lingered: would they confess to the crime that had shaken the nation, or would they take their secrets to the grave? The walls of the interrogation room closed in on Richard Hickock and Perry Smith as the KBI agents, led by Alvin Dewey, pressed them for answers. The evidence was mounting, and the men knew their time was up. Under the weight of relentless questioning, both finally cracked, but their confessions would be as haunting as the crime itself. Hickock was the first to speak. He admitted that he and Smith had driven to Holcomb that night, believing Herbert Clutter kept a safe with a fortune inside. Hickock claimed that the plan was his idea, a simple robbery with no intention of harming anyone. But when they realized there was no safe, he said, things spiraled out of control. According to Hickock, it was Smith who turned violent, slashing Herbert Clutter's throat and pulling the trigger on the shotgun. Smith, on the other hand, told a different story. He painted Hickock as the mastermind and claimed he had no choice but to go along. He admitted to firing some of the fatal shots, but insisted that Hickock had been just as complicit, egging him on and helping to subdue the family. Their accounts were chillingly detailed: how they had tied up the family, how they searched the house for non-existent cash, and how they killed each victim one by one to leave no witnesses. Yet the discrepancies in their stories were striking. Each man shifted the blame, portraying himself as less guilty than the other. One detail both men agreed on was the moment they realized the crime had been for nothing. After all the violence, all the horror, they had walked away with less than $50 in cash and a few personal items. The senselessness of the act weighed heavily on the investigators, who struggled to comprehend how such brutality could be committed for so little. The confessions gave the KBI the evidence they needed to charge Hickock and Smith with the murders, but they also left lingering questions. Who was the real instigator? Was one more responsible than the other? And what kind of darkness had driven two men to commit such a horrifying act? As the case moved toward trial, the community of Holcomb braced itself for what would come next. For the Clutter family, justice seemed inevitable, but the true nature of evil that had visited their home that night would forever remain a haunting mystery. By March of 1960, the courthouse in Garden City, Kansas, became the stage for a trial that gripped the nation. Richard Hickock and Perry Smith faced charges for the cold-blooded murders of the Clutter family. The trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was a battle of narratives, a clash between justice and the complex psychology of two men who had shocked the world. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case. They painted Hickock and Smith as calculating killers, presenting their confessions alongside physical evidence, a shotgun and a knife matching the wounds, boot prints found at the scene, and items stolen from the Clutter home. Prosecutor Dwayne West delivered an unflinching account of the murders, emphasizing the senseless brutality and the terror the family must have endured. The defense, however, took a different approach. They did not deny that Hickock and Smith were involved in the killings. There was no room for denial given the confessions. Instead, they sought to humanize the defendants, focusing on their troubled pasts. Smith's attorney highlighted his abusive childhood and history of mental health struggles, portraying him as a man shaped by trauma. Hickock's lawyer painted him as a follower, a man whose poor judgment led him down a dark path. Emotions ran high as witnesses testified. Family, friends, and neighbors spoke of the Clutter's kindness and the devastating impact of their deaths. For many, the most harrowing moment came when the crime scene photos were presented. The images, though sparingly shown, left an indelible mark on the jury and the audience. Yet, the trial was not without controversy. The defense argued that the media frenzy and the community's grief made it impossible for Hickock and Smith to receive a fair trial. Despite their efforts, it was clear that the weight of evidence and the sheer horror of the crime was too great to overcome. As the trial neared its conclusion, one thing became clear. The fate of Hickock and Smith lay in the hands of the jury. Would the court see them as cold-blooded killers deserving of the ultimate punishment, or as broken men who had succumbed to their darkest impulses? When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. For the families of both the victims and the defendants, this moment marked the culmination of months of grief, fear, and unanswered questions. But the wait would not be long. After only a few hours, the jury returned with their decision. Richard Hickock and Perry Smith were found guilty of first-degree murder on all counts. The courtroom was hushed as the judge delivered their sentences: death by hanging. It was the harshest penalty the law could impose, a punishment that matched the severity of the crime. For the town of Holcomb, the verdict brought a measure of closure. The shadow of fear that had loomed since the murders began to lift. Yet, not everyone felt satisfied. Some questioned the morality of capital punishment, wondering if two more deaths could truly bring justice for the Clutters. Others grappled with the unsettling reality of who Hickock and Smith were, not monsters, but deeply flawed human men. As Hickock and Smith were led out of the courtroom, their expressions betrayed little emotion. But their journey was far from over. The appeals process would stretch on for years, keeping the case and its moral complexities alive in the public consciousness. The verdict marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The Clutter murders had left an indelible scar on Holcomb, and the story of Hickock and Smith was not yet finished. Justice had been served, but the lingering question remained: could justice ever truly be enough? For Richard Hickock and Perry Smith, the trial's guilty verdict was not the end. Over the next 5 years, the pair waged a desperate battle against their sentences, exploiting every avenue available in the justice system. They filed appeal after appeal, challenging the fairness of their trial and the legality of their death sentences. Defense lawyers argued that the intense media scrutiny had biased the jury, and that Smith, in particular, had suffered from severe mental health issues that should have been considered mitigating factors. Hickok's attorneys, meanwhile, attempted to shift blame further onto Smith, claiming Hickock had been led astray by his co-defendant's influence. The appeals revealed the labyrinthine nature of the justice system, where even the most heinous crimes could be mired in legal wrangling for years. Public opinion grew divided. Supporters of the death penalty viewed the delays as an affront to justice, while opponents questioned whether executing two men, broken and remorseful, truly served any purpose. For the Clutter's surviving relatives and the people of Holcomb, the drawn-out appeals process reopened old wounds with each new filing. Every delay served as a painful reminder of the nightmare that had forever changed their town. Yet, through it all, the ultimate outcome seemed inevitable. April 14, 1965, marked the final chapter in the story of Richard Hickock and Perry Smith. After exhausting all possible appeals, the two men were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary. The execution was carried out in the early hours, witnessed by a small group that included law enforcement officials and members of the press. The mood was somber, even among those who believed justice had been served. Hickock maintained a calm, almost defiant demeanor, while Smith appeared reflective, offering a quiet apology in his final moments. Their deaths closed a long and painful chapter for the Clutter family and the town of Holcomb. For many, the executions brought a sense of closure. The killers of Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter had faced the ultimate punishment. Yet, for others, the lingering moral questions remained. Did the deaths of Hickock and Smith truly balance the scales of justice, or were they another tragic consequence of a senseless act? The Clutter murders might have faded into the annals of small-town tragedy if not for the interest of one man, author Truman Capote. The case fascinated Capote, who saw in it an opportunity to explore the psychology of crime and the broader implications of violence in American society. Accompanied by his close friend and fellow author Harper Lee, Capote traveled to Holcomb shortly after the murders. The pair immersed themselves in the town, conducting interviews with neighbors, law enforcement, and even the accused. Capote's charm and persistence opened doors that few outsiders could have accessed. What emerged from Capote's painstaking research was In Cold Blood, a work that would redefine the true crime genre. Blending journalistic rigor with literary flair, the book delved deeply into the lives of both the victims and the killers, offering an unflinching look at the tragedy from every angle. Yet, Capote's interest in the case was not without controversy. His close relationship with Perry Smith, in particular, raised questions about objectivity. Some critics accused Capote of sympathizing too much with the killers, while others praised his ability to humanize even the most monstrous acts. In Cold Blood would go on to become a bestseller, cementing Capote's place in literary history. But for the people of Holcomb, The book served as a haunting reminder of a chapter they longed to close. Through Capote's words, the Clutter family's story achieved a form of immortality, one that continues to provoke thought, debate, and sorrow to this day. Truman Capote's journey into the Clutter family murders wasn't just an investigation, it was an obsession. Spending years gathering information, interviewing everyone connected to the case, and poring over court documents, Capote sought to craft something entirely new. With his impeccable attention to detail and narrative brilliance, he blurred the lines between journalism and fiction, birthing a genre that had never been seen before, the nonfiction novel. Capote's In Cold Blood didn't simply recount the events. It pulled readers into the lives of the Clutters, their killers, and the town of Holcomb itself. He explored the psychology of Richard Hickock and Perry Smith, delving into their upbringing, their motivations, and the chilling randomness of their crime. Capote also captured the ripple effect the murders had on the small Kansas community, painting a picture of a town grappling with fear, grief, and the loss of its innocence. The writing process wasn't without its toll. Capote formed a complicated connection with Perry Smith, seeing in him a mix of humanity and darkness that fascinated and haunted him. Critics later questioned whether this attachment influenced the narrative, but one thing was undeniable. Capote's words created a vivid and unforgettable portrait of a crime that shattered a family and shocked a nation. When In Cold Blood was published, it became an instant phenomenon. The book's raw and gripping style captivated readers who were drawn into the dark world of the Clutter murders. For many, it was the first time they had encountered a true crime story told with such literary finesse, and it left them both horrified and transfixed. But with its success came controversy. Critics and readers debated the ethics of Capote's approach. Was it appropriate to fictionalize aspects of such a devastating real-life tragedy? Did Capote cross a line by humanizing the killers, or was he offering an unflinching look at the complexities of human behavior? The book also reignited conversations about the nature of evil. Was it inherent, or was it shaped by circumstance? For the people of Holcomb, the book was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought national attention to their tragedy, ensuring the Clutters would never be forgotten. On the other, it reopened wounds, forcing them to relive the horror and confront the way their town had been forever changed. Despite the debates, In Cold Blood became a cornerstone of modern literature, influencing not only true crime, but journalism and storytelling as a whole. It remains a powerful reminder of the devastating impact of violence and the complexities of justice and morality. The surviving members of the Clutter family were left to pick up the pieces after the unimaginable. For those closest to Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, moving forward was an uphill battle, weighed down by grief and the overwhelming loss of an entire branch of their family tree. But the Clutter's legacy didn't end with their deaths. Friends and relatives worked tirelessly to preserve their memory, focusing on the kindness, integrity, and warmth that had defined their lives. Herbert's work ethic, Bonnie's gentle spirit, Nancy's generosity, and Kenyon's bright potential became the stories passed down through generations, painting a picture of the family as they had lived, not as they had died. Holcomb itself underwent a transformation. The once idyllic town could never fully regain its sense of security, but the resilience of its people shone through. They supported one another, rebuilt their lives, and ensured that the Clutter's story was one of remembrance and strength, not just tragedy. For the Clutter family, the ultimate lesson was one of perseverance. Even in the face of unspeakable loss, They honored their loved ones by keeping their memory alive, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their story, though rooted in heartbreak, became one of resilience, hope, and the determination to never forget. The publication of In Cold Blood was a watershed moment, not just for literature, but for the true crime genre as a whole. Truman Capote's groundbreaking work showed that stories of real life crime could be told with depth, nuance, and literary artistry. It paved the way for countless authors, journalists, and filmmakers to explore the human psyche behind criminal acts and the ripple effects of violence on communities. From books to documentaries to podcasts, Capote's influence can be seen in every corner of true crime storytelling. His meticulous approach to research and his ability to balance fact with narrative drama became the gold standard for those who followed. Today, true crime is one of the most popular and enduring genres, captivating audiences who seek not just to understand the details of a crime, but the why behind it. The Clutter case, and Capote's retelling of it, raises profound ethical questions that resonate to this day. How do we, as storytellers, balance the public's fascination with crime against the need to respect the victims and their families? When does the pursuit of a gripping narrative cross the line into exploitation? Capote's work humanized the killers, but it also exposed the trauma and suffering of the Clutter family and their community. For some, this was a necessary exploration of the human condition. For others, it was a breach of privacy that turned tragedy into entertainment. These questions remain central to the true crime genre, challenging creators to approach their work with care, respect, and responsibility. Decades later, the Clutter family murders remain etched in the collective memory, not just as a tragic crime, but as a cultural milestone. The case continues to serve as a stark reminder of life's fragility and the devastating consequences of violence. It's a story of loss, justice, and the enduring search for meaning in the face of unimaginable tragedy. For the town of Holcomb, the Clutter's legacy lives on in their memory and the resilience of their community. For the true crime genre, their story remains a template for how to dig deeper, not just into the crime, but into the human truths beneath it. The Clutter murders compel us to ask hard questions about morality, justice, and the complexities of human behavior. What drives people to commit such horrific acts? Can justice truly bring closure? And how do we, as a society, reconcile the need to remember with the desire to move on? If this story gripped you as much as it did us, we encourage you to share your thoughts. Do you believe Capote's In Cold Blood honored the memory of the Clutters, or did it blur ethical lines? How do you feel about the balance between justice and the pursuit of understanding the minds behind such crimes? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a case that shaped true crime history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Crime Pulse Stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Together, we'll continue to unravel the mysteries of some of the most haunting cases in history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.